Welcome back to Never Did It. I am Brad Garoon, and I'm here with Jake Ziegler. What's up, Jake?
Just happy to be here and talking about more movies.
We are talking about the year 1970-something. What is it?
Well, it's 1976, but the release dates of these films are both a little up to interpretation.
Talk to us about the interpretation and your rules for this. I think we've talked about this before, but
yeah, definitely. We, as much as we can, we try to go with the release dates of when the films were actually released in the United States. It's a little different when we're dealing with older movies, that are like 40, 50 years old, because what difference does it make? It wasn't even in our lifetimes. But for the most part, like with newer movies, we choose to do the United States release date because we wouldn't have had a chance to see them. Like if a movie premieres in the Cannes Film Festival in 2022, but it doesn't open in the United States until March of 2023, well, the average Joe wouldn't have had a chance to have actually seen the movie in the United States until 2023. So we would consider that a 2023 movie. And both of the movies that we chose for the year 1976 actually had releases before 1976. The first one we chose was Solaris, which actually did debut at Cannes in 1972, didn't actually see a release in the United States until 1976. And Orson Welles' F for Fake was the other film that we chose, had played at a few film festivals as early as 1973, but again, didn't see a proper actual theatrical release until 1976.
Right. So we're recording this in July, and I bring that up just to say a modern example of this is there's an anime that came out in 2022 called The First Slam Dunk that I've been really wanting to see, and it debuts in American theaters in 2 weeks. So I'll be going to see that in 2023. But if we were to have reviewed that on the show, it would have been a 2023 movie. Let's chat about F for Fake. Why did you assign me F for Fake?
I think this was one of the years where I didn't have a ton of options just for what I had seen. I know you and I had both seen a lot of the same movies. And 1976, by the way, we'll talk about this probably a little bit more later on, is a pretty great year. There were a lot of really great classic films that came out this year. And I think we had both seen quite a few of them. And F for Fake, I had seen several years ago. I spent a summer basically, or a winter, living in Omaha, Nebraska one year. And there's a really cool nonprofit art house cinema there that did an entire Orson Welles repertory series. They showed Citizen Kane, they showed Touch of Evil, showed Lady from Shanghai, Magnificent Ambersons, and they showed F for Fake. And that was the first time I had seen it. And it's really interesting, kind of documentary. And Orson Welles is Orson Welles. His reputation precedes itself. And we've already talked about Citizen Kane on this show. And actually, a couple of those movies I mentioned will be hitting later on. I know Touch of Evil, I'm very excited to get to. So yeah, I just really thought it was an interesting movie. I thought you would enjoy it, and easily accessible on everybody's favorite Max.
So I did like it. I think I liked it more than you, actually. At least according to Letterboxd, I liked it more than you. It was interesting, like for the first fit. So this movie is about art forgery. It's a documentary about art forgery. There's no real reason that Orson Welles should be in it. It's not about him, but he's in it a ton. And he's mostly just showing how cool his life is in Europe, hanging out at cool restaurants with interesting artists and talking in a very Orson Welles way about what even art ownership. I can't do an Orson Welles impression, but he's basically doing an impression of himself. It's hilarious. It does get a little bit trying. And I say it gets trying, but I liked it more as it went on. The first 15 minutes, I had a very hard time locking into the movie. I didn't understand what I was watching. He's doing magic and talking in real vagaries about art ownership, what it means to plagiarize or not. I didn't really get a handle on who he was talking about. And I spent a lot of the first 15 minutes Wikipediaing who these people were that he was talking about. But they wound up being fascinating. And when we got to hear more from them, I really locked in. So the subjects of his movie are a guy named Elmire Dahori and then also Clifford Irving. Elmire Dahori is an art forger, or was an art forger. He passed away. By the time 1976 came around, I think he was already dead.
I think you're right, yeah.
And he was older in the movie, but I'm pretty sure he killed himself. And we'll get to why in a minute. So he was an art forger and a brilliant painter, and he claims, and also the authorities claim, that a lot of the paintings, the famous paintings that were in, and probably still are in museums, were actually painted by him. And the blame throughout the movie for that was placed on a lot of different people. It was placed on Elmire himself for creating them, although he's very flamboyant. He's a super interesting person, great personality, definitely a sociopath. You could put the blame on him for creating these things and putting them out into the world. You could blame art dealers for having no idea what they're talking about, not really knowing how to identify paintings and things like that. And you can blame museums for not doing the due diligence and putting these things up. It's just a lot of really interesting ways to look at what was going on.
A lot of moving parts, a lot of different facets to how this could even become a thing big enough of deal for someone like Orson Welles to to make a movie about.
And then it seems that Welles was close, or maybe not close, but was friends with these folks. So he seemed to be friends with Elmire. He seemed to be friends with Clifford Irving. Now, Clifford Irving is very famous, one, because he was Elmire's biographer. He was also supposedly the biographer of Howard Hughes. And then it turned out that his entire biography of Howard Hughes was fake. So this movie had two grifters in it, one of whom had been the biographer of the other, which is just fascinating. What I found most interesting was that it didn't get into Elmire's very, very, very interesting life story. This guy is a Holocaust survivor. His parents all died in the Holocaust. He escaped from a German hospital after being completely beaten, I imagine, half to death and put in the hospital, and then became a criminal after that through these forgeries and had to bounce from place to place. And this movie pretty much all takes place in Ibiza, where the authorities had been very lenient on him. Although he was arrested at some point. They talk about his arrest and his jail time at some point. And I think his eventual, I believe, suicide came from not wanting to go to jail again. He had this bodyguard who I think was also maybe a boyfriend.
That seemed that way. He was at least, and I think he started off like as a fan of him at first and just kind of wanted to kind of get near him at first. And then he ended up being the bodyguard, which is, I mean, that never ends well. There's just a lot of red flags with that.
That being said, it does seem like they had a rather close relationship right up until he died. And it does seem like he died because he was afraid to go back to jail and he overdosed. I'm pretty sure that's how he died. I could be remembering it wrong. Although I did just watch this pretty recently. So
I did as well. Yeah, I took the time to rewatch it because it had been 15 years probably since I'd seen it.
The Clifford Irving stuff is less interesting, although I did find the Howard Hughes bit and how, because I watched The Aviator actually pretty recently. Really fun movie.
It's great. Yeah.
If you can handle Cate Blanchett doing too accurate of an impression of Katharine Hepburn.
Katie. It always screws me up. It just messes me up whenever I hear DiCaprio or Howard Hughes call her Katie. I'm like, it's Katharine. I don't know.
But that is how Hepburn talked, and you have to wonder if Hepburn's affectation was totally fake, and then Blanchett had to. Anyway, we're not talking about The Aviator, but it was interesting to watch this after watching The Aviator because you see Hughes after, or you hear them talk about Hughes after his breakdown when he's holed up in a hotel room, and I don't believe it's the room he's holed up in the film, but in The Aviator, because that's in his house or in the studio.
Yeah, he was like in his screening room,
right,
in the movie. Yeah,
right. So this is a hotel room, I believe, in Reno. Or maybe Las Vegas off the strip.
And all I can picture is Mr. Burns,
right?
With the Kleenex boxes on his feet, and the getting Smithers to get in the spruce moose.
Yeah, absolutely, the spruce moose. But they do talk about the spruce goose a lot in F for Fake, because that was also in Welles's sort of connecting everything to fakeries and forgeries. He kind of calls the spruce goose its own kind of fakery because it didn't work, and it may have been a tax scheme or a way to get the government to fund something that was never going to work. And so was Howard Hughes also a big forger? Who knows? It's a really interesting movie, and it's a documentary unlike any you're really likely to see. Just going back to the Clifford Irving part not being so interesting. There is one part though where there is a monkey randomly grooming Clifford Irving during one of his interviews, and I was like, that's just great that they left that in. That's wonderful. The opulence is wild. But it is interesting that they never talk about anyone's identity. Like, they don't talk about Elmire's gay or Jewish identity. They don't talk about Irving's Jewish identity, which really they shouldn't, because it's not really a part of it. But they do talk. You do just have Welles sitting at restaurants talking himself about I don't know. It just was very clearly this is a documentary that probably only got made because Welles wanted to make it. And he's just such an outsized part of it when it's not really about him, except that he likes magic, kind of.
Yeah, it's a weird, like, pseudo documentary, but it's a performance for him still too. Like, you can definitely tell, like, he's Orson Welles in this movie. It's entertaining, actually, to a point, but there's, I don't know. I mean, maybe by the end of it, I was a little, maybe not exhausted by it would be too much. But I'm like, all right, it's enough. It's I'm Orson Welles out. I feel like, remember like The Critic. Remember the Critic when they showed the Orson Welles doing the commercials for frozen peas.
It's funny you bring that up because I recently saw a TikTok where someone was doing Orson Welles selling wine, but he's wasted and he keeps screwing it up. And the guy's impression of Orson Welles is very good, except he kind of puts on a British affectation where Orson Welles was very clearly doing like an American mid-Atlantic accent. Although it's a fake accent. He doesn't really sound like that, but it's not British. It's just people confuse Mid-Atlantic for British. Did you, when you saw this originally, I see you had this ranked at 3.5 on Letterboxd. Yes. I gave it 4, but I seem to remember that when I went in and watched it originally, you had it even lower.
I had it at 3 originally, yeah, because I remember thinking, that it was an interesting idea, but it was a little bit hard for me to latch onto at that time. And also, too, Letterboxd didn't come out until, was it 2013 or 14 when we all got on Letterboxd?
You got on it like 5 years before I did.
Did I? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, because I remember inviting you to it. I felt like
I probably made an account and
using it right away, right?
Literal years until I started using it.
That's right. Okay, so I want to say it was like maybe 2013 or 14 when it started, and I had seen this movie in the theater in 2010, and I had kept rough records of like star ratings and things, but I was more concerned with keeping like current things, like because I was still writing like current movie reviews and stuff, so I was keeping more current lists and things that I saw of older movies I didn't keep star ratings of quite as much. So it was when I got Letterboxd and I was trying to put star ratings on there, it was more of like an estimate kind of how well I remembered it sort of thing for some of those movies that I hadn't seen in a while, and my obsessive need to put a star rating on it even though I hadn't seen it in so long. So the 3 was a bit of a guess, and the 3.5 I think still holds pretty true, because it's really interesting, especially for if you have any interest in Orson Welles at all. It's very Orson it's a very Orson Welles performance. Definitely recommend it.
We're going to talk much more about your old Letterboxd reviews when we get to our next movie, because I have something that I discovered and it is such a treat and I'm surprising you with it. But this film, were there Oscars for Best Documentary at this time?
Yes. Yep, there definitely were. I mean, this certainly wouldn't have been one I think that the Academy would have gone for. I think it was a lot more traditional. So yeah, the documentary category actually first existed in the 40s.
Wow.
It's been around for actually quite a while. But of course, when it first started, a lot of it was just like literally in the first year was given out was 1942. There's like 20 something nominees here, and the titles, it's like Prelude to War, Africa, Prelude to Victory, Combat Report. It's all like, probably war propaganda stuff. So I think that's kind of how it started in 1976. I mean, I'm looking at the nominees here. Harlan County, USA. I do recognize that title. That was the winner of the Best Documentary that year. And then the other titles is Hollywood on Trial, Off the Edge, People of the Wind, and Volcano, an inquiry into the life and death of Malcolm Lowry.
And this film got like no awards, love at all. It seems like the public really hated it at the time.
I think, I don't think it was very well received. I think people were really kind of over him at this point, and I just don't think this was anything that anybody had much of an interest in.
It's funny how on a long enough timeline, most things, now nostalgia plays a big part of this, although I have no nostalgia for Orson Welles. I just saw Citizen Kane in full for the first time this year, or last year rather, and then beyond that, I haven't seen any of his movies, and I don't really care for him. The most I know about him is through The Critic.
Yeah. So wait till we see Touch of Evil, though, man. You're going to see Touch of Evil, and I'm going to gush about it all over this podcast, and I can't wait.
It's going to be so messy.
Yeah.
But I love this movie anyway. I think on a long enough timeline, a few things happen. One, there's nostalgia. Two, we start to be more accepting of things that seemed maybe avant-garde or off-putting in the past. And now we've seen so much that it just seems influential more than anything else. And also now everything is so samey, or not everything, but everything mainstream is so samey. And really throughout time, everything that's the most mainstream is the most samey, because that's why it is mainstream.
Right.
It's nice to go back and see the things that were falling through the cracks, because they're usually pretty interesting, even if they're not always effective. Like, for example, now Easy Rider now is hugely celebrated. I think it's pretty whatever, but I get why there's been a huge celebration of it, given everything that came before it and most of the stuff that was coming out at the time.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Although now it's just like sort of whatever.
Right.
Me.
It's not shocking or anything anymore.
No, it's a bit of a bummer, but that's it.
Right. Well, and I think F for Fake is another interesting line. We've talked about The Thin Blue Line earlier, and we talked about The Act of Killing. I think F for Fake kind of falls into that same sort of category of like really did something different with a documentary than like what a lot of other people were doing. And I think that is why it lasts, and why it's still something that you and I would talk about on a podcast 50 years after it came out.
It's interesting you say that, because Thin Blue Line is what I sort of consider the birth of the modern documentary, but this came out 10 years before that?
Yeah, 15. Yeah, I mean, it was because it was showing around in the early. It was showing a couple of years before it officially released. So yeah, I mean, it was around for a while. Yeah.
So what do I know?
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a lot.
Big time. Yeah.
Actually, we don't have to go too far, because Ibiza is not so far from St. Petersburg, but it is very far from the planet of Solaris.
Yes, it is.
I asked you to watch the Tarkovsky film Solaris. This is a very well regarded, I would say almost ponderous sci-fi film in the vein of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which it was made in direct response to. At the height of the Cold War, I gave it to you because I was surprised you hadn't seen it, for one thing. You've never seen a Tarkovsky film, right? Or you hadn't?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
I can't 100% blame you. They're struggles as much as they're anything. They're super interesting, but they're really struggles. And they're also the most influential sci-fi artifacts outside of 2001.
Mm-hmm.
I'll run down what this movie is real quick, and then well, actually, I'm not going to run down what it is because you just watched it, and it's been, I think, like a year and a half since I did. What I'll do is just say, yeah, I just gave it to you because I thought you should see it. And this is Andrei Tarkovsky is a giant in the history of film, especially sci-fi, between this and Stalker, and I just thought you should see it.
Those are all good reasons, and this would have probably been on one of my on my short list of things that, what are people most surprised that you haven't seen, this movie or Stalker, or maybe it would be like a co-entry, of something, things that you should have seen that you haven't by now. So yeah, I'm definitely glad you recommended it, and I was excited to watch it. It's about, there was a mission to a planet, a fictional planet called Solaris, and there are some very mysterious things that are going on there, and everyone's really vague about it because they don't really quite know how to explain it. They want this guy, Chris Calvin has the experience and the psychological knowledge, to kind of go up there and investigate what's going on, see what's happening, see if they can salvage the mission, see if they can get the people home from this foreign planet, just kind of get a handle on what's going on up there. And I think we can talk at some length about what goes on because, again, it's a 50-year-old movie. So
we should spoil the hell out of this movie.
We'll just spoil the hell out of this movie.
Also, just the twist happens in the beginning. I think it's okay to spoil it.
Definitely, you think so? Yeah. So what's happening is Solaris, the planet, is creating basically people. They're people, but they're not people. But it's creating human not characters.
They're human. Like it is creating. They're real. They're tangible.
They're tangible, but they're they're created out of
subatomic particles.
Yeah, they're not made out of atoms. They're made of neutrinos. Neutrinos, yes, that's what it is. Yeah, they're made out of neutrinos, so they look like people, they talk like people. They're, for all intents and purposes, they're people. They're made differently, and what they're made out of is the memories of the people who are on board the ship.
They're certainly not the people that they look like.
Right. They're not that person, no matter how much the person may want them to be, because the person that he gets confronted with is his wife, who had died 10 years earlier. Very, very tragically too. So he has a lot of guilt, and now he has this chance to be with someone again who looks like his wife and who talks like his wife, and he knows it's not his wife, but oh boy, he's really tempted to treat her like his wife. There's a lot of interesting conversations they have about that, like just the ethics behind it, and the science behind it, and the morals behind it. And the other, what's the older scientist name, the one who looks like Lance Henriksen? They have that great scene where they're at his birthday party, and there's just so many really great discussions there. And the thing about this movie too is that when even when Chris is like, when he's sleeping, they show him sleeping for like 2 minutes. I mean, they linger on a lot of these shots and just a lot of like what's going on. It's a leisurely pace. But I was really enthralled with it, and we're just really fascinated by the whole thing, and just the look of it. Again, this is 50 years old, but the look of the movie was great. I mean, the inside of the ship design, was really cool. The oceans of Solaris, look really cool, and just really, really cool story beats and dynamics between the characters. And I'm not as much of a sci-fi historian, maybe as others maybe, but I don't think there was a lot of sci-fi movies that really had this level of depth. I think that's what Tarkovsky was going to, because he even thought 2001 was shallow, as my understanding of it, and he was really wanting to increase the emotional depth and the emotional weight that the characters could carry the movie, and Solaris definitely does that, and I think does it really well.
He also thought that the book Solaris that his film was based on was shallow, and he changed the focus of the movie from being the relationship between Calvin and the being that looks like his dead wife to being about this ethical problem of what makes a person, what makes a life. Because at the end of the movie, you find that Calvin has chosen to stay behind on Solaris and be sucked in by Solaris, where he is with his dad, even though he knows it's not his dad, although his dad is still alive on Earth. He's hanging out with him at the beginning of the movie, but he's with his dad, and he crumbles into his dad's embrace at the end of the movie when he realizes, this is my dad, but it's not my dad, but I can be whoever I want to be here because different reality. It's very interesting. But I only gave it 3.5 stars because I thought it was very slow and I had a hard time getting through it. Now you went 4.5, right?
I went 4.5. Yeah. Like I thought I was going to have a hard time getting through it all, but I really didn't. I thought it, like when I was looking at the, I'd have to pause it to get up or whatever, be like, oh gosh, wow, I'm already, an hour and 20 minutes into it. It didn't feel like that at all to me. Yeah. It just hit me at the right time, I think, where I was really, really into it.
Yeah. So now you asked me to watch the remake.
Correct.
It's a bonus. And I think we're going to be doing a little bit more of these as they go. But anyway, we're really talking about this in relation to the original because the 2002 version by Steven Soderbergh, starring George Clooney, and I don't know how to pronounce her name.
Natasha.
She's like the most beautiful woman of all time.
Incredible. Yeah. I mean, she's true. I mean, Truman Show. I mean,
she had this great little run of Ronin, The Truman Show, and this movie, and Solaris. And then she fell off a little. Well, I can't say she fell off. She has a really successful television career. She was in Californication. I forget the other shows, but she's always worked. Mm-hmm. She's terrific in it. Viola Davis has a small role. She's very good.
Jeremy Davies
being the most Jeremy Davies he's ever been in this movie. I love Jeremy Davies from Lost, but in this movie, he's just doing his whole like snapping and pointing and talking like he's a jazz singer kind of guy.
Well, there's actually, then you find out there's a good reason for that too.
He is
really good reason for that. Yeah.
He's not himself. Right. He's still trying to figure out who he is. I like the remake a lot. It moves a lot faster than the original. And there were moments, ironically, where I thought, I wish that this scene would linger a little longer before moving on. It also, the ship in the remake is very sterile. And one of the things I liked about the original was that the ship was trashed because people had actually been living there and had been suffering there.
There was like blankets over the chairs and stuff. You know what I mean? Like it looked like people had been living there.
Right. And in the new one, there's blood on some of the walls because his friend has killed himself in the beginning of the movie. But and other people have, and then as you find out, Jeremy Davies has in a way killed himself, but in a different way. He killed his doppelganger. I just remember thinking, there's this really interesting thing. Soderbergh is such a student of the game and does so many interesting things in his movies. In this, and I know that I haven't seen it in a while. I know that the Tarkovsky version also does stuff like this with the sound design. But Soderbergh will have static in the background of scenes, and it'll be louder. At least I thought it was louder in certain scenes based on what the characters were feeling in the scene, how much anxiety they were under in a given scene. But you could really hear the volume of the background white noise changing from scene to scene. There wasn't any in his flashbacks where he remembered his life with his wife, Clooney as Chris Calvin, but there were tons on the ship when he was figuring out what was going on. His wife appears, and in both versions, both Clooney and Donatas Banyonis, both as Chris Calvin, at first, when their wife appears, they launch her into space. Because
that's kind of crazy. I forgot that, like, because I had seen the remake before I'd seen the original, but it's so long ago I didn't remember. I totally didn't realize that the first thing, and I jumped out of my shit. I'm like, oh my god, he's going to just launch her.
Yeah, it was wild. Yeah. And in the remake, that comes back to bite him a little bit, and I didn't like that. And I'll talk about that in a second. But it's interesting that for both, I mean, the general beats for both are the same. They launch her into space because they're scared because she's dead. Then they fall in love with her, and Viola Davis's character suggests that they're being seduced, and that comes up a lot in the original as well. And then he fights to bring her back to Earth, while Viola Davis is like, "No, what if this is contagious? This would destroy Earth. We can't have this." What I didn't like about the remake, although I thought the remake moved at a great pace after the first maybe 15 minutes, it slowed down a little bit and took its time, and I got really into it. But I didn't like Clooney's character as much as I liked Donatas's character for the main reason that the whole point of them being a psychologist or a psychiatrist is that they're supposed to really grapple with like you said earlier on, they're supposed to really grapple with the ethics of what's going on the ship. But Soderbergh was more true to the original story than he was to the Russian movie, in that he was much more concerned with the romance between Clooney and his dead wife. And I just thought that first off, it made Clooney really unlikable, which is fine, but like kind of made him a loser. And it flew in the face of why even have him be a psychiatrist if he's going to be the one being like, nothing matters but love.
Yeah.
So I didn't like that so much. The Jeremy Davies thing was very interesting. Didn't really go anywhere except to be a cool little twist, but fun. Yeah. Good stuff. Also 3.5 stars. I thought it was just very good in a different way.
And I also gave it 3.5 stars. So I liked it, just not as much as the Tarkovsky one. The romance angle, I just don't think is as, even though that's truer to the book, I didn't find it as interesting as, the ethical moral dilemma of, also there's a whole, and both movies do this, where it's in the new one, it's the Viola Davis character. And in the older one, I don't remember the scientist's name, where they have a thing that's called like the Annihilator, or the Annihilator, that can kill these beings.
In the new one, because there was so much research going on about the Higgs boson, and they hadn't discovered it yet, but there was a lot of stuff in the news about it. They were like, oh, I think that they're created by a Higgs field and we could use a boson. Yeah. That's really funny. This science is already so outdated. This movie only came out 20 years ago.
But yeah, so that all was in there. And I think that it just wasn't as much of a focus in the new one. The new one's good. I mean, I think it's really interesting, and it's again different than a lot of sci-fi movies. And I think they make an interesting comparison, and I think they're both worth watching.
So I want to read you something. This was your you've posted a review of this movie in 2014 to Letterboxd that I assume you wrote in 2002.
Yeah, must have. That was the only other time I saw it. Wow.
It's still on Letterboxd. So credit to, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read a few excerpts from it that I thought were interesting. Credit to, I assume, the Kalamazoo Gazette.
Or just maybe 411. Might have just been 411 Mania.
Or 411mania.com, which at the time might have just been 411wrestling.com. Early on in the latest film from the very talented Steven Soderbergh, we see several shots that must be paying homage to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, what I find so interesting about that is it does feel like Soderbergh was more influenced by Kubrick than he was by Tarkovsky, especially in the humanity that he wanted to imbue the movie with. This should help prepare serious film goers as to what kind of movie Solaris is going to be. But even knowing that is not adequate preparation. I'm sorry if this is making you cringe hearing your old stuff, but this is really well written.
Oh, thank you.
It is truly more of an avant-garde film rather than classical cinema, as it delves into issues and emotions not commonly seen in today's Hollywood fluff. Now, what I found most interesting about that is there's way more stuff like this in Hollywood now, in part. Well, I want to say in part because of this, but this movie bombed hard because it was marketed as a straight sci-fi thriller, and it was not that.
Yeah. And then they made the same mistake almost 8 years later with The American. We're like, it's George Clooney in an action movie. Look, he's got a gun and he's running. And it's not that at all. And
Never did it.
That movie bombed hard too.
I have no idea what that movie is.
It's great.
I'll check it out. Oh, this made me miss George Clooney so much.
I know. He's such a movie star.
Maybe I'll just watch Ticket to Paradise. And
maybe I will too.
So yeah, Solaris 2002 is not really a faithful adaptation of the original Solaris, except that the plot is exactly the same, but a much more interesting adaptation of a Tarkovsky film. Well, it's actually not an adaptation of a Tarkovsky film, but Alex Garland's Annihilation, which came out in 2018, is based on a novel, but it is so clearly drawing from Stalker, which is another really ponderous movie about what it means to be alive at the end of the world. Kind of, it's a bit of a post-apocalyptic. And I actually think Annihilation improves on Stalker in pace. This is funny. There's a moment in Annihilation where a sound is made by an animal that is so unnerving, it actually made me feel ill. Do you know about the uncanny valley, that concept? Mm-hmm. So for any listener who doesn't know, although I think our listeners are very smart, the uncanny valley is when things look almost completely familiar to what we're used to, but just enough off that it sets off an alarm in your head. You're like, that's not quite right. We see it a lot with AI images where like there's one too many fingers or the hands meld together, or in robots that they make now that look almost real, but the mouth is moving kind of weird. That's the uncanny valley. This had an uncanny valley for audio, and I actually felt ill. And the reason I bring it up is some of our earlier episodes, we have pretty bad audio, and I've tried to go back and fix it, but the tool I used to fix it made your voice sound so weird that it gave me that same like, oh, I'm nauseous listening to this like digitalization, trying to like digitally fix. I didn't like it. Anyway, Annihilation has that. It is the most I've felt ill ever by a sound. And I'll just say it's a bear that makes the sound. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, check it out. It's a great movie.
Yeah. Annihilation is very cool.
So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Did Solaris get any Oscar love at all? The original?
No, none. Not even a whisper.
It's funny with these older movies how foreign films, if they don't strike immediately and big, they don't strike. We don't have top 10 lists for 1976, but I would like to look at the other 1976 movies I've seen to see what was great. I mean, look, there's some real like crazy bangers that year. Network, Taxi Driver, Rocky, All the President's Men, Marathon Man. And then I also love Logan's Run. There's a bizarre Peter Ustinov Disney movie called Treasure of Metacumbe. Albert Brooks did some of his really great shorts in that year. Carrie, The Omen. I haven't seen Carrie or The Omen, but
I haven't either. Pink Panther Strikes Again came out that year too. I love those Pink Panther movies. Peter Sellers, those are great.
I've only seen the original. But yeah, those top 5 movies, or for me, the top 5 movies of 76 are Rocky, Taxi Driver, Network, All the President's Men, and Marathon Man. And Logan's Run, because that's also Peter Ustinov. Peter Ustinov just tearing it up in 1976.
Oh yeah, the Shootist was that year too. I believe that was John Wayne's last movie, and that was pretty good. One of the Stars Born remakes came out that year. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of high level stuff that year.
Yeah, Outlaw Josie Wales, Bad News Bears came out that year.
Oh yeah,
the movie Bugsy, the one with the kids, weird stuff. That's it, right? Anything else you want to say about Solaris's?
The Solarises, I think, are really interesting and definitely worth a watch. I think they do pair well together because I think they cover a lot of the same ground, but I think they cover some different ground too. And plus, it's just a treat to see George Clooney in a movie.
For sure. If you at all like the Christopher Nolan sci-fi movies, they pull heavy from Solaris.
I don't know why I keep nodding so much, like people can see me. You guys can't see me, but I nod a lot.
For sure.
Yeah.
If you're into weird, like Jake said in his 2002 review of Solaris 2002, if you're into like avant-garde sci-fi, The Fountain, which I don't like, but some people obviously do because they let Darren Aronofsky keep making movies. That's obviously very heavily pulling from Solaris. If you're into anime, there's a crazy anime by Mamoru Oshii who made Ghost in the Shell, which I don't like, but he made another movie called Angel Egg, which I like more. And Angel Egg is obviously super pulling from the original Solaris. And I believe Angel Egg is on the Internet Archive. So if you want to just watch a really weird anime about a girl carrying an egg in a post-apocalypse, that's the one.
Sounds great.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for hanging out with us in our 1976 movies that didn't actually come out in 1976. If you want to know what is coming out next week, go to our Letterboxd profile. You can find me at Brad Garoon on Letterboxd. I think Jake, you're Jake Ziegler on Letterboxd.
Yep, it's Jake_Ziegler.
And both of us have pinned to our profiles our Never Did It podcast list. You could also just search for the Never Did It podcast list. And the 2 movies that will be discussed on next week's episode are always at the top of that list. So check that out. And thank you for joining us for Never Did It.